What if I told you that a teenage prisoner of war became the most powerful advisor to three of history's greatest empires? That he survived execution plots, decoded impossible mysteries, spent a night with hungry lions and walked out without a scratch? This isn't fantasy. This is the true account of Daniel, a man whose faith was so unshakable that it literally stopped the jaws of beasts and brought kings to their knees. His story begins with devastation, betrayal, and the complete destruction of everything he knew. But what happens next will show you why Daniel's name has echoed through millennia as the ultimate testament to unwavering conviction in the face of impossible odds. The year was 605 BCE, and the kingdom of Judah stood on the precipice of catastrophe. For generations, the prophets had warned that judgment was coming, that the nation's persistent idolatry and abandonment of God's covenant would bring devastating consequences. Now, that day had arrived. King Jehoiakim sat upon the throne of Judah, but his kingdom was merely a shadow of the glorious united monarchy that David and Solomon had built centuries before. The great Assyrian Empire, which had destroyed the northern kingdom of Israel over a century earlier, had itself fallen to a new superpower, rising from Mesopotamia, Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar II, whose name meant Nabu, protect my heir, was not merely a conqueror, he was a brilliant military strategist and an ambitious builder who would transform Babylon into the most magnificent city the ancient world had ever seen. The famous Hanging Gardens, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, would be constructed under his reign, but before glory came conquest. In the 3rd year of Jehoiakim's reign, Nebuchadnezzar besieged Jerusalem. This was not merely a military defeat, it was a theological crisis. The temple vessels, sacred objects dedicated to the worship of Yahweh, were now being carried off to Babylon to be placed in the treasury of Nebuchadnezzar's gods. For the people of Judah, this seemed to suggest that their God had been defeated, that the covenant he made with their fathers had been broken. Among the captives, forcibly marched across hundreds of miles of desert, was a young man whose Hebrew name was Daniel, meaning, God is my judge. We don't know his exact age, but the text indicates he was young, likely in his mid to late teens. He came from nobility, possibly even royal lineage, which is why he was selected for Nebuchadnezzar's unique program. Imagine the psychological trauma of this journey. Daniel watched as Jerusalem's walls were breached, heard the cries of his people, perhaps witnessed the death of family members and friends. Everything familiar, the streets where he played as a child, the temple where he worshipped, the language and customs that defined his identity was being stripped away. The journey to Babylon would have taken several months, crossing harsh desert terrain with minimal provisions. Many captives would not have survived. Yet Daniel endured, and what awaited him in Babylon was unlike anything he could have imagined. Nebuchadnezzar's strategy was far more sophisticated than simple military conquest. He understood that truly controlling an empire required winning hearts and minds, not just battles. His plan for the Jewish captives reveals a cunning psychological operation designed to completely transform their identity. The king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to select young men from the Israelite royal family and nobility. The criteria were specific and demanding. These young men had to be without physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. They would be taught the language and literature of the Babylonians. Notice the criteria. These weren't random captives. Nebuchadnezzar wanted the best and brightest, the future leaders who could have restored Judah's independence. By removing them and converting them into Babylonian officials, he was effectively decapitating any future Jewish resistance. The 3-year program was comprehensive. They would learn Akkadian, the lingua franca of the Babylonian Empire. They would study Babylonian astronomy, mathematics, divination, and literature, including texts that directly contradicted their Hebrew faith. the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Enuma Elish creation myth, incantations to Marduk and Ishtar. All of this would be drilled into them. But the acculturation went even deeper. Daniel and his three companions, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, were given new names, a practice designed to erase their Jewish identity. Daniel became Belteshazzar, meaning Bel, protect his life, directly linking him to the Babylonian god Bel. Hananiah, whose Hebrew name meant Yahweh is gracious, became Shadrach, possibly meaning command of Aku, the moon god. Mishael, meaning who is what God is, became Meshach, possibly who is what Aku is. And Azariah, meaning Yahweh has helped, became Abednego, meaning servant of Nebo, another Babylonian deity. Even their names now proclaimed allegiance to foreign gods. Everything about this program was designed to make them forget they were Hebrews and transform them into loyal Babylonians. Then came the moment that would define Daniel's entire life. The king assigned them a daily portion of royal food and wine, an honor that most captives would have gladly accepted. To refuse the king's provision was not just ungrateful, it was potentially treasonous. But Daniel faced a profound dilemma. The royal food and wine posed several problems for a devout Jew. First, the meat was likely not kosher, either from forbidden animals or not slaughtered according to Jewish law. Second, portions of the food were probably first offered to Babylonian idols as part of pagan rituals before being served. To consume such food would be, in Jewish understanding, to participate in idol worship. Here we see the first glimpse of Daniel's character. He resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. Consider what Daniel was risking. He was a teenage captive in a foreign land with no power, no protection, and no allies. One word from Ashpenaz could mean torture or execution. The easy path, the path that probably 99% of people in his situation would take, was to rationalize, God will understand. I'm a prisoner. I have no choice. It's not really my fault. But Daniel didn't rationalize. The text says he resolved this was a firm, deliberate decision made before the moment of testing arrived. This is a crucial lesson. Character is forged in advance. Daniel didn't wait until the food was before him to decide what to do. He had already determined in his heart to honor God, regardless of the cost. God honored Daniel's resolution by moving Ashpenaz to view him favorably. But favorability didn't eliminate the official's fear. Ashpenaz responded that he was afraid of the king, who had assigned their food and drink. Why should the king see them looking worse than the other young men their age? The king would then have Ashpenaz's head because of them. Here's where Daniel's wisdom shines. He didn't demand or rebel. He proposed a test. He approached the guard whom Ashpenaz had appointed over him and his friends and made a simple request. Test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see. This was brilliant negotiation. Daniel framed it as a low-risk experiment with a clear evaluation metric. If they looked worse after 10 days, the guard could force them to eat the royal food. If they looked better, the guard had nothing to fear from the king. The result? At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables instead. This was more than a dietary victory. It was a public demonstration that obedience to God brings blessing, even when it seems to contradict human wisdom. The other Jewish youths in the program who had compromised and eaten the royal food now watched as Daniel and his friends thrived on a seemingly inferior diet. God was making a statement. But God's favor extended far beyond physical health. To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning. And Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. This wasn't merely the result of hard study. the text explicitly states that God gave them this wisdom. In a court filled with Babylonian wise men who had studied for decades, these 4 Jewish teenagers would soon surpass them all. When the 3 years ended, Ashpenaz presented all the trainees to King Nebuchadnezzar for evaluation. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. 10 times better, not slightly better, not marginally superior. 10 times better than trained professionals who had dedicated their entire lives to these disciplines. This was a supernatural demonstration of God's power, and it positioned Daniel and his friends in places of extraordinary influence. The next crisis came suddenly and threatened the lives of every wise man in Babylon, including Daniel. In the 2nd year of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar had a dream that troubled him deeply. He summoned all his magicians, enchanters, sorcerers, and astrologers, and made an unprecedented demand. The king told them he had a dream that troubled him and wanted to know what it meant. His wise men responded with the standard formula: "Tell your servants the dream, and we will interpret it." But then came the shocking twist. The king replied that this is what he had firmly decided. If they did not tell him what his dream was and interpret it, he would have them cut into pieces and their houses turned into piles of rubble. This was extraordinary. Never before had a king demanded that his advisors tell him his own dream. The wise men protested, "There is no one on earth who can do what the king asks." No king, however great and mighty, has ever asked such a thing of any magician or enchanter or astrologer. What the king asks is too difficult. No one can reveal it to the king except the gods, and they do not live among humans. Their answer enraged Nebuchadnezzar. If they couldn't tell him his dream, how could he trust any interpretation they gave? If they claimed to have supernatural insight but couldn't access his own thoughts, weren't they frauds? The king issued a decree: execute all the wise men of Babylon. This edict included Daniel and his companions, even though they hadn't been summoned to the original audience. When Arioch, the commander of the king's guard, came to execute them, Daniel responded with remarkable composure. He spoke to Arioch with wisdom and tact, asking why the king had issued such a harsh decree. Arioch then explained the matter to Daniel. At this, Daniel went in to the king and asked for time, so that he might interpret the dream for him. Think about the audacity of this moment. The king had just ordered all wise men executed for failing an impossible test. And here comes a young Jewish exile requesting an audience and asking for more time. Yet somehow, Daniel gained access to the king and secured a reprieve. What happened next reveals the source of Daniel's confidence. He didn't frantically study dream interpretation manuals or consult with the other wise men. Instead, Daniel returned to his house and explained the matter to his friends Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. He urged them to plead for mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that he and his friends might not be executed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Here we see the power of corporate prayer. Daniel didn't face this crisis alone. He gathered his closest friends, men who shared his faith and commitment, and they prayed together. They didn't pray for escape or for a different assignment. They prayed specifically that God would reveal the mystery. That night, God answered. During the night, the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision. Daniel's response teaches us something profound about humility and gratitude. Before rushing to the king, before saving his own life and the lives of the other wise men, Daniel stopped to worship. His prayer is one of the most beautiful expressions of praise in Scripture. He blessed the name of God forever and ever, acknowledging that wisdom and power belonged to him. He praised God for changing times and seasons, deposing kings and raising up others, giving wisdom to the wise and knowledge to the discerning. He thanked God for revealing deep and hidden things, for knowing what lies in darkness, and for making known what they had asked. Notice that Daniel credited God entirely. He didn't think, "I prayed, and now I have special powers." He recognized that the revelation was purely a gift of grace. Daniel then went to Arioch and said something that further demonstrates his character. "Do not execute the wise men of Babylon. Take me to the king, and I will interpret his dream for him." Even though the other wise men were his competitors, even though they served false gods, Daniel interceded for their lives. Brought before Nebuchadnezzar, Daniel made something clear from the start. When the king asked if he could tell him the dream and interpret it, Daniel replied that no wise man, enchanter, magician, or diviner can explain to the king the mystery he has asked about. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. Daniel refused to take credit. He pointed directly to the source, the God of heaven. Then he proceeded to describe the king's dream in perfect detail. The dream, as Daniel related it, was of an enormous statue, dazzling in appearance and terrifying. Its head was pure gold, its chest and arms were silver, its belly and thighs were bronze, its legs were iron, and its feet were partly iron and partly baked clay. As Nebuchadnezzar watched, a rock was cut out, but not by human hands. It struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and smashed them. The entire statue, gold, silver, bronze, iron, and clay, shattered into pieces that became like chaff blown away by the wind. But the rock that struck the statue became a huge mountain that filled the whole earth. The king must have been astounded. Every detail matched exactly what he had dreamed, but couldn't remember. But what did it mean? Daniel's interpretation provided a roadmap of world history, spanning from that moment to the end of human kingdoms. He told Nebuchadnezzar that he was the King of Kings. The God of heaven had given him dominion and power and might and glory. In his hands he had placed all mankind, and the beasts of the field, and the birds in the sky. Wherever they live, he had made him ruler over them all. Nebuchadnezzar was that head of gold. Nebuchadnezzar's Babylonian empire was the head of gold, magnificent, wealthy, but temporary. After him, another kingdom would arise, inferior to his. Next, a third kingdom, one of bronze, would rule over the whole earth. Finally, there would be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron, for iron breaks and smashes everything, and as iron breaks things to pieces, so it would crush and break all the others. History confirms Daniel's prophecy with stunning accuracy. After Babylon came the Medo-Persian Empire, the silver, then the Greek Empire under Alexander the Great, the bronze, and finally the Roman Empire, the iron, each successive kingdom larger in territory, but in some ways less glorious than its predecessor. But the most important part of the vision concerned the rock cut without human hands. In the time of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, nor will it be left to another people. It will crush all those kingdoms and bring them to an end, but it will itself endure forever. This was a prophecy of God's eternal kingdom, a kingdom not established by human power but by divine intervention. For Christians, this points to the kingdom inaugurated by Christ, which will be fully realized at his return. Nebuchadnezzar's response was remarkable. This pagan king, the most powerful man on earth, fell prostrate before Daniel. He paid Daniel honor and ordered that an offering and incense be presented to him. The king declared that surely Daniel's God is the God of gods and the Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries, for Daniel was able to reveal this mystery. The king promoted Daniel to a high position, made him ruler over the entire province of Babylon, and placed him in charge of all the wise men. Daniel, demonstrating his loyalty to his friends, requested that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be appointed administrators over the province of Babylon, while he remained at the royal court. A captive teenager had become the second most powerful man in the empire, all because he refused to compromise his faith. But with power came danger. Not long after Daniel's promotion, King Nebuchadnezzar erected an enormous statue of gold, 90 feet high and 9 feet wide, on the plain of Dura. He summoned all the officials of his kingdom for its dedication. Then came the decree, announced by a herald. As soon as everyone heard the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, they must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Whoever did not fall down and worship would immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace. This wasn't merely a test of loyalty to the king. It was idolatry, a direct violation of the first and second commandments God had given to Israel. For Daniel's 3 friends, there was no question. They could not bow. Jealous officials quickly reported to the king, "There are some Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, your majesty. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold you have set up." Furious, Nebuchadnezzar summoned the 3 men and gave them one more chance. But their answer stands as one of the greatest declarations of faith in all Scripture. They told King Nebuchadnezzar that they did not need to defend themselves before him in this matter. If they were thrown into the blazing furnace, the God they serve is able to deliver them from it, and he will deliver them from the king's hand. But even if he does not, they wanted the king to know that they would not serve his gods or worship the image of gold he had set up. Notice the profound theology in their response. But even if he does not, they believed God could save them, but they didn't presume he would. Their faithfulness wasn't conditional on deliverance. They would obey God whether he rescued them or not. This is faith in its purest form, trusting God's character even when you can't predict his actions. Nebuchadnezzar, enraged beyond reason, ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual. He commanded his strongest soldiers to bind the 3 men and throw them into the flames. The fire was so intense that it killed the soldiers who threw them in. But then something impossible happened. The king, watching from a safe distance, suddenly leaped to his feet in amazement. He asked his advisors if they hadn't tied up 3 men and thrown them into the fire. His advisors confirmed, "Certainly, your majesty." The king said he saw 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looked like a son of the gods. Who was this 4th figure? Many biblical scholars believe it was a pre-incarnate appearance of Christ, a theophany, a visible manifestation of God. God himself had entered the furnace to be with his faithful servants in their trial. Nebuchadnezzar approached the furnace and shouted for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, to come out. When they emerged, everyone gathered saw the miracle with their own eyes. The satraps, prefects, governors, and royal advisors crowded around them. They saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair of their heads singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. Not even the smell of smoke. The only things that burned were their bonds. Once again, a pagan king was forced to acknowledge the power of Israel's God. Nebuchadnezzar issued a decree that anyone who spoke against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego would be severely punished, and he promoted the 3 men to even higher positions. Years passed, and Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom reached unprecedented heights of glory and prosperity. The Hanging Gardens, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, graced the skyline of Babylon. The city's walls were so massive that chariots could race atop them. Tributes flowed in from conquered nations, and the king's wealth seemed limitless. But prosperity has a way of corrupting the human heart, and Nebuchadnezzar was no exception. Despite witnessing multiple miracles, Daniel's interpretation of his dreams, the deliverance of the 3 Hebrew men from the furnace, the king's heart grew proud. He began to attribute his success to his own power rather than to the God who had granted it. It was during this time that Nebuchadnezzar had another dream, one even more troubling than the first. Once again, He summoned all the wise men of Babylon, and once again, none could interpret it. Finally, he called for Daniel, whom he addressed by his Babylonian name, Belteshazzar. The dream was vivid and disturbing. The king saw an enormous tree in the middle of the earth, growing so large and strong that its top touched the sky, and it was visible to the ends of the earth. Its leaves were beautiful, its fruit abundant, providing food for all. Wild animals found shelter under it, and birds nested in its branches. Then a holy messenger descended from heaven and called out to cut down the tree and trim off its branches, strip off its leaves and scatter its fruit. Let the animals flee from under it and the birds from its branches. But let the stump and its roots, bound with iron and bronze, remain in the ground, in the grass of the field. Let him be drenched with the dew of heaven, and let him live with the animals among the plants of the earth. Let his mind be changed from that of a man, and let him be given the mind of an animal, till 7 times pass by for him. When Daniel heard this dream, something remarkable happened. He was greatly perplexed for a time, and his thoughts terrified him. Why was Daniel terrified? Because he understood the interpretation immediately, and he cared deeply for the king he served. Despite Nebuchadnezzar's pagan beliefs and occasional cruelty, despite the fact that he had destroyed Jerusalem and carried Daniel into exile, Daniel had developed genuine affection for this powerful but troubled monarch. Nebuchadnezzar, noticing Daniel's distress, told him not to let the dream or its meaning alarm him. Daniel's response reveals his compassionate heart. He wished the dream applied to the king's enemies and its meaning to his adversaries. Then, with the courage that characterized his entire life, Daniel delivered the sobering interpretation. The great tree represented Nebuchadnezzar himself. His kingdom had grown great and strong, reaching to distant parts of the earth. But the decree to cut down the tree was a judgment from heaven. The king would be driven away from people and would live with the wild animals, eating grass like cattle and being drenched with the dew of heaven. 7 periods of time would pass. Most scholars believe this means 7 years, until the king acknowledged that the Most High is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth. But there was a glimmer of hope. The stump with its roots was to be left in the ground, bound with iron and bronze. This meant that Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom would be restored to him once he acknowledged God's sovereignty. Daniel, demonstrating pastoral concern, urged the king to renounce his sins by doing what is right, and his wickedness by being kind to the oppressed. It may be that then his prosperity would continue. Here we see that God's judgments are often conditional. If Nebuchadnezzar would humble himself and change his ways, perhaps the prophesied judgment could be averted. God takes no pleasure in punishing the wicked. He desires repentance. But Nebuchadnezzar did not heed Daniel's warning. For 12 months, nothing happened. The king likely convinced himself that the dream meant nothing, that Daniel had been mistaken, or that he had somehow avoided the judgment through his continued success. Then came the day of reckoning. 12 months later, as the king was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon, he declared, "Is not this the great Babylon I have built as the royal residence? By my mighty power and for the glory of my majesty?" The words were barely out of his mouth when judgment fell. Even as the words were on his lips, a voice came from heaven declaring that his royal authority had been taken from him. Immediately, the prophecy was fulfilled. The greatest king on earth was struck with a form of insanity that modern scholars have attempted to diagnose as either boanthropy, a psychological disorder where a person believes they are a cow or ox, or a divinely imposed condition unique to this situation. Whatever the medical explanation, the spiritual reality was clear. God had humbled the proud king. Nebuchadnezzar was driven from human society. He lived in the fields, eating grass like cattle. His body was drenched with the dew of heaven until his hair grew long like eagle's feathers and his nails became like bird's claws. The man who had built the most magnificent city in the world now lived like a beast in the wilderness. For 7 years, 7 complete cycles of seasons, this condition persisted. Imagine the horror of the Babylonian court. Where was their mighty king? What had happened to the ruler who had conquered nations? Some may have assumed he was dead. Others may have tried to seize power. But somehow, according to God's sovereign plan, the kingdom remained intact, waiting for its king to return. Then, at the appointed time, Nebuchadnezzar's sanity returned. At the end of that time, he raised his eyes toward heaven, and his sanity was restored. Then he praised the Most High. He honored and glorified him who lives forever. The king who had refused to acknowledge God's sovereignty now wrote a public testimony. In it, he declared profound truths about God's eternal dominion, his authority over earthly kingdoms, and his power to humble the proud. Nebuchadnezzar concluded his testimony with words that showed genuine transformation. Now I praise and exalt and glorify the King of heaven, because everything he does is right and all his ways are just. And those who walk in pride he is able to humble. This is one of the most remarkable conversion accounts in Scripture. A pagan king, through severe discipline, came to acknowledge the true God. And notice that Daniel's role throughout was not to gloat or condemn, but to faithfully interpret God's word and compassionately urge repentance. Daniel's faithful witness over decades had an impact that transcended mere political service. But the lessons learned by one generation are often forgotten by the next. Years passed, and Nebuchadnezzar died. Eventually, the throne passed to his grandson Belshazzar, who lacked his grandfather's hard-won wisdom about the God of heaven. By this time, Daniel was an old man, probably in his 80s. The political situation had changed dramatically. The Babylonian Empire, which had seemed invincible under Nebuchadnezzar, was now threatened by a rising coalition of Medes and Persians. In fact, on the very night our story continues, the armies of Cyrus the Persian were outside Babylon's walls, preparing to breach them. But inside the palace, King Belshazzar was throwing a party, and not just any party, a feast for 1,000 of his nobles, a defiant celebration in the face of the siege. Wine flowed freely, and in his drunken arrogance, Belshazzar made a catastrophic decision. While drinking his wine, he gave orders to bring in the gold and silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken from the temple in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, his wives and his concubines, might drink from them. So they brought in the gold goblets that had been taken from the temple of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles, his wives and his concubines drank from them. As they drank the wine, they praised the gods of gold and silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone. This was not mere revelry. It was deliberate blasphemy. These vessels had been consecrated for worship in God's temple. To use them for a drunken orgy while praising pagan idols was an act of profound sacrilege. Belshazzar was essentially mocking the God of heaven, proclaiming that Babylon's gods were superior since they had defeated Jerusalem. God's response was immediate and terrifying. Suddenly, the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall near the lampstand in the royal palace. The king watched the hand as it wrote. Imagine the scene. The laughter and music suddenly stop. All eyes turn to see a disembodied hand, just the fingers, nothing else, writing mysterious words on the palace wall. The flickering lamplight would have made the sight even more eerie and supernatural. The effect on Belshazzar was instantaneous. His face turned pale, and he was so frightened that his legs became weak and his knees were knocking. The proud king, who moments before had been drinking from God's holy vessels in mocking defiance, was now trembling with terror. He called for his enchanters, astrologers, and diviners, promising that whoever could read the writing and explain its meaning would be clothed in purple, receive a gold chain, and be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom. But none of Babylon's wise men could even read the inscription, let alone interpret it. This increased the king's terror and confusion. The queen, likely the queen mother, possibly a wife of Nebuchadnezzar and grandmother to Belshazzar, heard the commotion and entered the banquet hall. She told the king not to be alarmed or look so pale. "There is a man in your kingdom who has the spirit of the holy gods in him. In the time of your father he was found to have insight and intelligence and wisdom like that of the gods. Your father, King Nebuchadnezzar, appointed him chief of the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and diviners. He did this because Daniel, whom the king called Belteshazzar, was found to have a keen mind and knowledge and understanding, and also the ability to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve difficult problems. Call for Daniel, and he will tell you what the writing means." Notice that even though Daniel had apparently been sidelined during Belshazzar's reign, the king didn't even know who he was. His reputation remained intact. The queen mother remembered, and her testimony carried weight. When Daniel was brought before the king, Belshazzar offered him the same rewards he had promised the other wise men: purple robes, a gold chain, and the position of third highest ruler in the kingdom. Daniel's response reveals a man who had long ago learned where true value lay. He told the king to keep his gifts for himself and give his rewards to someone else. Nevertheless, he would read the writing for the king and tell him what it means. Daniel wasn't interested in Belshazzar's rewards. He had served under Nebuchadnezzar with distinction, and he understood that this kingdom's hours were numbered. But before interpreting the writing, Daniel delivered a scathing indictment of the king. First, he reminded Belshazzar of the lesson God had taught Nebuchadnezzar, how the Most High God gave him sovereignty, greatness, glory, and majesty. But when his heart became proud, God humbled him and drove him from his throne until he acknowledged God's sovereignty. Then came Daniel's rebuke. "But you, Belshazzar, his son, have not humbled yourself, though you knew all this. Instead, you have set yourself up against the Lord of heaven. You had the goblets from his temple brought to you, and you and your nobles, your wives and your concubines drank wine from them. You praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which cannot see or hear or understand. But you did not honor the God who holds in his hand your life and all your ways." This is one of the most powerful statements in Scripture about human accountability. Belshazzar had the example of his grandfather before him. He knew what happened when someone defied God. Yet he chose to repeat the same pride, amplified by deliberate blasphemy. His sin was not ignorance, but willful rebellion. Therefore, Daniel explained, God had sent the hand that wrote on the wall. The inscription read, Men, Tekel, Parsin. These were Aramaic words related to weights and currency, but Daniel revealed their prophetic meaning. Mene, God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. You have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Each word was a sentence of doom. The repetition of Mene emphasized certainty. God had not just numbered the days, but had completed the count. Tekel declared Belshazzar's moral bankruptcy weighed in God's balances. He was found lacking in every quality that matters. Parsin announced the transfer of power to the coalition armies, even then breaching the city's defenses. True to his word, Belshazzar clothed Daniel in purple, placed a gold chain around his neck, and proclaimed him third highest ruler in the kingdom. But these honors were meaningless. Within hours, the kingdom would cease to exist. That very night, Belshazzar, king of the Babylonians, was slain, and Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. The armies of Cyrus had diverted the Euphrates River, which flowed through Babylon, and entered the city through the riverbed. They found the gates near the river left open, perhaps through treachery, perhaps through the carelessness of drunken guards. The supposedly impregnable city fell without a major battle. Babylon, The golden head of the statue in Nebuchadnezzar's dream had been replaced by the silver chest and arms of the Medo-Persian Empire. Daniel's interpretation from decades earlier was being fulfilled before his eyes. The fall of Babylon could have meant disaster for Daniel. New regimes typically purge officials from previous administrations, especially those as prominent as Daniel had been. At his advanced age, probably mid-80s by now, Daniel might have expected forced retirement at best, execution at worst. But God had other plans. Darius the Mede, recognizing Daniel's exceptional abilities, appointed him as one of 3 administrators over the entire kingdom. Under these 3 administrators served 120 satraps who governed various regions. Now Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. Even in his 80s, even in a completely new political system, Daniel's excellence was undeniable. His integrity, wisdom, and administrative skill stood out so dramatically that Darius intended to make him prime minister of the entire Medo-Persian Empire. This created a problem. The other administrators and satraps, likely younger men who had served the Medo-Persian system their entire careers, were jealous. They felt passed over and humiliated that a foreigner, an elderly Hebrew who had served Babylon, should be elevated above them. So they did what envious people always do. They looked for dirt. The administrators and the satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs, but they were unable to do so. They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. Think about what this reveals. These were Daniel's political rivals, men with every motivation to discover scandal. They had access to government records, could question subordinates, could examine every decision Daniel had made. They were looking for any hint of corruption, any evidence of negligence, any questionable judgment call they could exploit. And they found nothing, not a single compromising transaction, not one neglected duty, not even a gray area they could spin to look suspicious. After decades in government service, first under Babylon, now under Persia, Daniel's record was spotless. This is an extraordinary testimony. Government service presents constant temptations, bribes, favoritism, using insider knowledge for personal gain, cutting corners, covering up mistakes. Yet Daniel's integrity remained intact through regime changes, cultural shifts, and the corrupting influence of absolute power nearby. Finally, his enemies reached a crucial conclusion. We will never find any basis for charges against this man Daniel unless it has something to do with the law of his God. This statement is revealing on multiple levels. First, it confirms Daniel's impeccable character. They acknowledged they couldn't attack him legitimately. Second, it shows that Daniel's religious devotion was well known throughout the government. Third, and most importantly, it demonstrates that Daniel had never hidden his faith, even though it made him vulnerable. Everyone knew he was devoted to the God of Israel, and everyone knew this devotion was non-negotiable. So they hatched a plan that was brilliantly devious in its simplicity. The conspirators approached King Darius as a unified group, creating the impression of unanimous support from the government's leadership. They told the king that all the royal administrators, prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors had agreed that the king should issue an edict and enforce a decree. Anyone who prays to any god or human being during the next 30 days, except to the king, shall be thrown into the lion's den. Several elements made this proposal attractive to the king. First, it positioned him as semi-divine, an object of worship, something that appealed to the ego of ancient monarchs. Second, it was presented as a consensus recommendation from his entire government. Third, it was only for 30 days, so it seemed like a temporary measure to consolidate loyalty during a transition period. Fourth, it invoked the law of the Medes and Persians, which once written could not be changed even by the king who issued it. The immutability of Medo-Persian law was both a strength and a weakness of their legal system. It provided stability and prevented arbitrary tyranny, but it also meant that even a wise king couldn't correct a foolish decree once issued. So King Darius put the decree in writing. The trap was set. The conspirators knew exactly what would happen next. They didn't have to wait long. When Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he faced a moment that would define his entire legacy. He had several options available to him. He could rationalize, "Surely God will understand if I pray secretly for 30 days. It's just a temporary decree. My public witness won't be damaged because I'll resume my normal practice once the 30 days are over." Or he could modify his practice. "I'll continue to pray 3 times a day, but I'll close the windows and pray quietly so no one knows. I'll still be faithful to God in my heart, even if I'm not as public about it." Or he could try to find a loophole. The decree says, "I can't pray to any god or human except the king." Maybe I can pray while also addressing the king somehow, technically fulfilling the letter of the law while maintaining my relationship with God. These rationalizations might sound absurd, but they're exactly the kinds of compromises people make every day when faith conflicts with career, safety, or social acceptance. Daniel could have justified any of them. Instead, when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened toward Jerusalem. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before. Let's unpack the significance of this response. First, when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he didn't act in ignorance. He knew exactly what the consequences would be. This wasn't accidental defiance. It was deliberate faithfulness. Second, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened toward Jerusalem. He didn't try to hide. He could have prayed in a windowless room or in a closet. Instead, he maintained his usual practice of praying with windows open toward Jerusalem, following the pattern described during Solomon's dedication of the temple. Third, 3 times a day, he got down on his knees and prayed. He didn't reduce the frequency or change the posture. Kneeling was a vulnerable position, a visible act of submission and worship. Fourth, giving thanks to his God. This is remarkable. Daniel wasn't praying desperate prayers for deliverance. He was giving thanks, maintaining his regular practice of gratitude to God. Even facing a death sentence, his prayer life remained focused on worship and thanksgiving. Finally, just as he had done before, perhaps the most important phrase, Daniel wasn't staging a protest. He wasn't trying to make a political statement. He was simply continuing the same devotional practice he had maintained for decades, possibly his entire adult life. The decree didn't change Daniel's behavior because Daniel's ultimate allegiance had been settled long ago. This is a crucial lesson about character in crisis. Daniel didn't become faithful in the moment of testing. He was simply continuing to be the person he had always been. His response to the decree was determined by decisions made years and decades earlier. The habits of a lifetime don't change because of a temporary decree. The conspirators, of course, were watching. They knew Daniel's routine and were waiting for this exact moment. As soon as they saw him praying, they hurried to the king. The conspirators approached Darius with feigned concern for law and order. First, they confirmed that the king remembered his own decree. "Did you not publish a decree that during the next 30 days, anyone who prays to any god or human being, except to you, your majesty, would be thrown into the lion's den?" When the king confirmed this, they sprang their trap. Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, your majesty, or to the decree you put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day. Notice how they described Daniel, one of the exiles from Judah. They didn't acknowledge his position or his decades of faithful service. They reduced him to his ethnicity and foreign status, trying to create an us versus them mentality. It's a tactic as old as human civilization and still used today to dehumanize the target to make their punishment easier to accept. The king's response reveals his genuine affection for Daniel. When the king heard this, he was greatly distressed. He was determined to rescue Daniel and made every effort until sundown to save him. For hours, Darius tried to find a legal way out. He consulted with legal scholars, examined precedents, explored every possible loophole. But the law of the Medes and Persians was unbreakable. Even the king who issued a decree could not revoke it. As the sun set, the conspirators returned to press their advantage, reminding Darius that according to the law of the Medes and Persians, no decree or edict that the king issues can be changed. Darius had no choice. The very legal system that protected his authority now bound his hands. He was forced to condemn a man he respected and valued, trapped by his own decree. The king gave the order, and Daniel was arrested and brought to the lion's den. Before Daniel was thrown in, Darius said something remarkable. "May your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you." This statement is packed with meaning. Even though Darius was forced to execute Daniel, he expressed hope that Daniel's God would intervene. The phrase, "whom you serve continually," acknowledges what everyone knew. Daniel's devotion to God was unwavering and constant. And the plea for rescue reveals that Darius had likely heard the stories of God's previous interventions, the dream interpretations, the deliverance of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego from the furnace. Daniel was thrown into the den, and a stone was brought and placed over the opening. The king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the rings of his nobles, ensuring that no one could tamper with the situation. No secret rescue attempt could be made. Then King Darius returned to his palace for what would be the longest night of his life. The king returned to his palace and spent the night without eating and without any entertainment being brought to him, and he could not sleep. Picture the contrast. In the palace, the king of the vast Medo-Persian Empire lay awake, tormented by anxiety, unable to eat or be distracted from his worry. Meanwhile, in a den filled with lions, an 80-something-year-old Hebrew exile experienced something entirely different. The Bible doesn't tell us exactly what happened in the den during those dark hours, but we can infer from Daniel's later testimony and from the pattern we see throughout his life. While the king wrestled with guilt and fear, Daniel likely spent the night in prayer and worship, at peace despite his circumstances. Lions are apex predators. A den of lions would normally contain multiple animals. Archaeology has uncovered ancient lion pits that suggest they could hold a dozen or more lions. These weren't tame or well-fed zoo animals. They were kept hungry to make executions more certain and spectacular. A human thrown into such a den would typically survive mere seconds before being torn apart. But God had other plans. Just as he had sent an angel to protect Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in flames that didn't burn, God now performed another miracle. The lions, despite their predatory instincts and hunger, did not touch Daniel. We can imagine Daniel, perhaps sitting calmly in the midst of these fearsome beasts, praising God through the night. The same faith that had sustained him through decades of exile, through multiple regime changes, through conspiracies and political intrigue, now sustained him in the lion's den. He had committed himself to God's will, and whether that meant miraculous deliverance or faithful death, Daniel was at peace. Meanwhile, as the first light of dawn broke over Babylon, King Darius couldn't wait any longer. At the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. When he came near the den, he called to Daniel in an anguished voice, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions?" Notice several things about the king's words. First, at the first light of dawn, he didn't wait a moment longer than necessary. He had been awake all night, and as soon as there was light enough to see, he rushed to the den. Second, he called to Daniel in an anguished voice. This wasn't a formal royal inquiry. this was a man crying out in genuine distress, hoping against hope that somehow his trusted advisor had survived. Third, servant of the living God Darius didn't refer to Daniel by his title or position. He identified him by his relationship to God. And he called Daniel's God the living God, implicitly contrasting him with the dead idols of Babylon and Persia. Fourth, whom you serve continually again. This phrase emphasizes Daniel's consistent, unwavering devotion. Everyone who knew Daniel knew that his service to God was his defining characteristic. Finally, has your God been able to rescue you? The question reveals both doubt and hope. Could any God really control lions and protect a man in such circumstances? Darius was about to receive a dramatic answer. From inside the den came a voice, Daniel's voice, clear and strong. May the king live forever. My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight, nor have I ever done any wrong before you, your majesty. The joy that must have flooded through Darius in that moment is hard to imagine. Daniel was alive. God had indeed performed a miracle. Daniel's response deserves careful examination. First, may the king live forever despite everything. Daniel showed respect to the king. He didn't blame Darius or speak bitterly about the injustice he had suffered. He understood that the king had been manipulated and had actually tried to save him. Second, my God sent his angel. Daniel gave credit where it was due. This wasn't luck or the lions being uncharacteristically docile. God had actively intervened, sending an angel to protect his servant. Third, he shut the mouths of the lions. The miracle wasn't that the lions weren't present or weren't hungry. They were there, they were dangerous, but God supernaturally prevented them from attacking. Their mouths were shut, unable to open to bite or roar. Fourth, I was found innocent in his sight. Daniel's faithfulness and integrity had been vindicated not just before humans but before God. He had been weighed in the divine balances and found righteous. Finally, nor have I ever done any wrong before you, your majesty. Daniel asserted his innocence of any actual crime. He hadn't been disloyal to the king. He had simply been faithful to God. The king was overjoyed and gave orders to lift Daniel out of the den. And when Daniel was lifted from the den, no wound was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. The phrase, "no wound was found on him," is significant. This wasn't a case where Daniel had been attacked but somehow survived his injuries. There was no evidence the lions had touched him at all. Not a scratch, not a bite mark, not even a bruise. The miracle was complete and undeniable. The text gives us the reason for this protection: because he had trusted in his God. Daniel's deliverance wasn't about his own merit or goodness, though he was indeed righteous. It was about his trust, his complete reliance on God, regardless of the outcome. This echoes what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had said: "Even if he does not deliver us, we will not serve your gods." Faith doesn't presume on God's actions, but it trusts his character absolutely. Now justice came swiftly. At the king's command, the men who had falsely accused Daniel were brought in and thrown into the lion's den, along with their wives and children. And before they reached the floor of the den, the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. This severe punishment serves multiple purposes in the narrative. First, it demonstrates that the lions were indeed dangerous. This wasn't a case of the lions being old or sick or well-fed. They immediately attacked and devoured the conspirators, proving that Daniel's survival was miraculous, not natural. Second, it shows the seriousness of the conspiracy. These men had deliberately manipulated the king and the law to murder an innocent man. Their punishment, while harsh by modern standards, was consistent with ancient Near Eastern justice systems, where those who bore false witness faced the punishment they had sought to inflict on others. Third, it provided closure and vindication. Daniel's enemies were removed, and any doubt about God's intervention was eliminated. The miraculous deliverance of Daniel led King Darius to issue one of the most remarkable decrees in the biblical narrative. Then King Darius wrote to all the nations and peoples of every language in all the earth, "May you prosper greatly. I issue a decree that in every part of my kingdom people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions." This decree is extraordinary for several reasons. First, it was sent to all the nations and peoples of every language in all the earth. This was a universal proclamation throughout the vast Medo-Persian Empire, which at its height would extend from India to Ethiopia, encompassing millions of people. Second, it acknowledged specific attributes of the God of Israel that contradicted pagan theology. Darius declared that Daniel's God is the living God, unlike the dead idols of wood, stone, and metal that couldn't see, hear, or act. He endures forever. He's not a temporary or local deity, but eternal. His kingdom will not be destroyed, unlike human kingdoms that rise and fall. His dominion will never end. He is perpetually sovereign. Third, Darius testified to God's active power. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. This wasn't abstract theology. The king was testifying to what he had witnessed firsthand. Fourth, the decree commanded that people fear and reverence this God, not merely acknowledge his existence, but actively honor him with appropriate awe and respect. This decree, issued by a pagan king, proclaimed truth about God throughout a vast empire. Daniel's faithful witness, his integrity in government service, his unwavering devotion to prayer, his trust in God even facing death, had resulted in the knowledge of the true God spreading to millions who otherwise might never have heard of him. The account concludes with a simple statement. So Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. This verse summarizes years of continued service. Daniel, now vindicated and protected by royal decree, continued in his position of authority. He served under Darius and then under Cyrus the Great, one of history's most remarkable rulers. Cyrus is particularly significant in biblical history. He is the king whom God called by name in the prophecy of Isaiah, predicted about 150 years before his birth. Cyrus issued the decree allowing the Jewish exiles to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. Daniel almost certainly played a role in this decision. Imagine the scene. Daniel, who had been taken captive from Jerusalem as a teenager, who had spent his entire adult life in exile, now had the opportunity to influence the king who would end that exile for his people. The young man who had been forced into Babylonian service now stood as an advisor to the Persian emperor who would reverse Babylon's policies and allow the Jews to go home. Some scholars suggest that Daniel may have shown Cyrus the prophecies in Isaiah that mentioned him by name, demonstrating that the God of Israel had predicted Cyrus's rise to power and his role in restoring Jerusalem. Whether or not this happened, it's clear that Daniel's position gave him access to influence this crucial historical decision. However, it's important to note that Daniel himself apparently didn't return to Jerusalem. By the time Cyrus issued his decree around 538 BCE, Daniel would have been close to 90 years old. The journey back to Jerusalem was long and difficult, not suitable for an elderly man. Moreover, Daniel's presence in the Persian court may have been more valuable to his people than his return to Jerusalem. As a highly placed official, he could protect and advocate for the returning exiles. While Daniel's political service continued, he also received a series of remarkable prophetic visions that form the second half of the book of Daniel. These visions were given at different points in his life, not in chronological order as presented in the book. The first major vision came in the first year of Belshazzar's reign, actually before the events of the writing on the wall and the lion's den, though recorded after them. In this vision, Daniel saw 4 great beasts rising from the sea: a lion with eagle's wings, a bear, a leopard with 4 wings and 4 heads, and a terrifying 4th beast with iron teeth and 10 horns. These beasts represented the same succession of kingdoms shown in Nebuchadnezzar's dream of the statue, but from a different perspective. Where Nebuchadnezzar's dream showed human kingdoms from a human viewpoint, a glorious statue, Daniel's vision showed them from God's perspective as beasts, predatory, brutal, and temporary. But the vision didn't end with earthly kingdoms. Daniel saw something far more significant. In his vision at night, there appeared one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. This vision of one like a son of man is one of the most important messianic prophecies in the Old Testament. Jesus repeatedly referred to himself as the Son of Man, directly claiming this identity. The vision shows the Messiah receiving an eternal kingdom from God himself, a kingdom that, unlike the temporary kingdoms of Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome, would never end. In the 3rd year of Belshazzar's reign, Daniel received another vision, this one remarkably specific about future events. He saw a ram with 2 horns representing the Medo-Persian Empire being attacked and defeated by a goat, with a prominent horn representing Greece under Alexander the Great. The vision then showed the prominent horn being broken and replaced by 4 horns, the division of Alexander's empire among his 4 generals after his death. This prophecy was so accurate that skeptical scholars have sometimes claimed it must have been written after the events occurred. But this misses the point. The accuracy of the prophecy demonstrates that it came from God, who knows the end from the beginning. Perhaps the most famous and debated of Daniel's prophecies is the 70 weeks prophecy. This came during the 1st year of Darius the Mede's reign, shortly after the fall of Babylon. The vision begins with Daniel studying the prophecies of Jeremiah, who had predicted that the exile would last 70 years. Daniel realized that the 70 years were almost complete, so he began to pray fervently for his people's restoration. His prayer is one of the most beautiful and heartfelt prayers of confession in Scripture. Daniel identified completely with his people's sins, even though he personally had been faithful. He pleaded with God based not on Israel's righteousness, which didn't exist, but on God's mercy and his own reputation. While Daniel was still praying, the angel Gabriel appeared to him with a message. Gabriel said he had come to give Daniel insight and understanding. Then he delivered the prophecy of the 77s, or weeks. The prophecy states, 77s are decreed for your people and your holy city to finish transgression, to put an end to sin, to atone for wickedness, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. Most scholars understand these 7s to mean periods of 7 years, so 77s would equal 490 years. The prophecy then divides this period into 3 parts: 7 sevens totaling 49 years, 62 sevens totaling 434 years, and 1 final 7 totaling 7 years. The prophecy continues, "Know and understand this. From the time the word goes out to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the Anointed One, the ruler, comes, there will be 7 sevens and 62 sevens. It will be rebuilt with streets and a trench. But in times of trouble, after the 62 sevens, the Anointed One will be put to death and will have nothing." This prophecy has been interpreted various ways, but many scholars see it as predicting the time between the decree to rebuild Jerusalem and the coming of the Messiah, the Anointed One. If we calculate from the decree of Artaxerxes in 445 BCE and count 483 years 69 sevens, we arrive remarkably close to the time of Jesus Christ's public ministry and crucifixion. when the Anointed One was put to death. The prophecy concludes by describing the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, which occurred in 70 CE when the Romans sacked the city. The people of the ruler who will come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. This prophecy provided hope to the exiled Jews that God had not abandoned them, that the Messiah would come according to a divine timetable, and that God's purposes would ultimately triumph. Daniel's final visions came in the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia, when Daniel was in his 80s. These visions are unique in Scripture for the detailed glimpse they provide into spiritual warfare, the unseen conflict between angels and demons that affects earthly events. Daniel had been mourning for 3 weeks, fasting and praying, when he saw a magnificent vision of a heavenly being. The description is remarkably similar to later visions of the risen Christ. He looked up, and there before him was a man dressed in linen, with a belt of fine gold around his waist. His body was like topaz, his face like lightning, his eyes like flaming torches, his arms and legs like the gleam of burnished bronze, and his voice like the sound of a multitude. This vision was so overwhelming that Daniel collapsed in weakness. The being touched Daniel and helped him to his feet, then explained the reason for the delay in answering Daniel's prayer. The angel said, "Do not be afraid, Daniel. Since the first day that you set your mind to gain understanding and to humble yourself before your God, your words were heard, and I have come in response to them. But the prince of the Persian kingdom resisted me 21 days. Then Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me, because I was detained there with the king of Persia." This passage reveals that Daniel's prayers were heard immediately, but the answer was delayed by spiritual warfare. A demonic entity called the Prince of the Persian Kingdom had opposed the angel, and it required the intervention of Michael the archangel to break through. This shows that earthly politics and international events are influenced by spiritual forces. The fate of nations is not merely determined by human decisions and military might, but by spiritual conflict in heavenly realms. Yet our prayers matter. Daniel's persistent prayer was heard, and heaven responded even though spiritual opposition caused delay. The angel then delivered an extensive prophecy detailing conflicts between future kingdoms, particularly focusing on the wars between the Seleucid Empire, the king of the north, and the Ptolemaic Empire, the king of the south, 2 of the kingdoms that emerged from Alexander's divided empire. The level of detail in this prophecy is extraordinary, accurately predicting specific battles, alliances, and betrayals centuries in advance. The prophecy culminates with a description of a persecuting king who will exalt and magnify himself above every god and will say unheard of things against the God of gods. This description has been applied both to the Seleucid king Antiochus, the 4th Epiphanes, who desecrated the Jerusalem temple in 167 BCE, and to a future Antichrist figure who will arise before Christ's return. Daniel's final chapter includes one of the clearest prophecies of resurrection in the Old Testament. At that time, Michael, the great prince who protects your people, will arise. There will be a time of distress, such as has not happened from the beginning of nations until then. But at that time, your people, everyone whose name is found written in the book, will be delivered. Multitudes who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake, some to everlasting life, others to shame and everlasting contempt. Those who are wise will shine like the brightness of the heavens, and those who lead many to righteousness like the stars, forever and ever. This prophecy looks forward to a time of unprecedented tribulation, followed by a resurrection not just of the righteous, but of all people, some to eternal life, and some to eternal judgment. This was a revolutionary concept in its time, providing hope that death was not the end, and that justice would ultimately prevail. Daniel was then told to close up and seal the words of the scroll until the time of the end. The full meaning of these prophecies would not be understood until their fulfillment drew near. The book concludes with a personal message to Daniel. "As for you, go your way till the end. You will rest, and then at the end of the days, you will rise to receive your allotted inheritance. This was God's promise to his faithful servant. Daniel's earthly life would end, but it was not truly the end. He would wrest the biblical euphemism for death, but he would rise again to receive his reward. We don't know exactly when or how Daniel died. The last recorded event in his life occurs in the 3rd year of Cyrus, which would place Daniel in his mid-80s at minimum. He may have lived even longer. Jewish tradition suggests he died in his late 80s or early 90s, still serving in some capacity in the Persian government. But Daniel's influence extended far beyond his lifetime. His book became one of the most important in Jewish and Christian scripture, providing comfort to persecuted believers through the centuries and offering a framework for understanding God's sovereignty over history. When Jesus wanted to teach his disciples about the end times, he referenced Daniel's prophecies. He spoke of the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of through the prophet Daniel, validating Daniel as a true prophet and pointing to his writings as essential for understanding future events. The book of Revelation, written by the Apostle John at the end of the 1st century CE, draws heavily from Daniel's imagery. The beasts, the Ancient of Days, the Son of Man coming with clouds, the resurrection of the dead, all these themes from Daniel reappear in John's apocalyptic vision, creating a theological continuity between the Old and New Testaments. For the early Christians facing persecution under Roman emperors, Daniel's story provided crucial encouragement. If Daniel could remain faithful in Nebuchadnezzar's court, if Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego could trust God in the furnace, if Daniel could survive the lion's den, then believers could endure whatever trials came their way. The message was clear. Earthly kingdoms are temporary, but God's kingdom is eternal. Throughout church history, Daniel has been a favorite subject for art, literature, and preaching. Paintings of Daniel in the lion's den adorn ancient catacombs, medieval manuscripts, Renaissance canvases, and modern churches. The image of a man at peace among beasts, protected by divine power, has inspired countless believers facing their own lions' dens of persecution, disease, financial ruin, or personal tragedy. Daniel's life offers profound lessons that remain relevant millennia after his death. Consider what we learn from this extraordinary man. The power of early decisions. Daniel's resolve not to defile himself with the king's food was made early in his captivity. This early commitment to faithfulness shaped his entire life. The time to decide how you'll respond to temptation is before the temptation arrives. Excellence in secular work. Daniel didn't retreat into religious isolation. He mastered Babylonian literature and language, became an expert administrator, and consistently performed his duties with such excellence that even his enemies could find no corruption in him. Our secular work is an arena for glorifying God. Integrity under pressure. From Nebuchadnezzar to Belshazzar to Darius, Daniel maintained his integrity regardless of who held power. He spoke truth even when it was dangerous, refused to compromise even when it would have been easier, and kept his word even when circumstances changed. Character doesn't fluctuate with circumstances. The priority of prayer. Daniel's practice of praying 3 times daily was so well established that his enemies built a trap around it. In a life filled with political responsibilities and court intrigues, Daniel prioritized his relationship with God. Our intimacy with God must not be sacrificed on the altar of busyness. Courage to stand alone. When the decree was issued, Daniel didn't gather signatures for a petition or organize a protest. He didn't wait to see what others would do. He simply continued his faithful practice, even though it meant standing alone. Sometimes, faithfulness requires us to take positions that are unpopular or even dangerous. Trust in God's sovereignty. Throughout his life, from the initial exile to the lion's den, Daniel demonstrated trust in God's sovereign control of history. He knew that empires rise and fall, but God remains. This trust produced peace in circumstances that would paralyze most people with fear. Humility in success. Though he rose to the highest levels of government service, Daniel consistently gave credit to God. When interpreting dreams or receiving honors, he always pointed beyond himself to the source of his wisdom and success. Long-term faithfulness. Daniel's story spans more than 70 years of service under multiple kings and 2 empires. His faithfulness wasn't a sprint, but a marathon. He remained true to God from his youth into his 80s, demonstrating that faithful endurance matters more than spectacular moments. Impact through influence. Daniel's faithful service in pagan governments led 3 different kings, Nebuchadnezzar, Darius, and presumably Cyrus, to issue decrees acknowledging the God of Israel. His witness influenced the spiritual climate of an entire empire. We never know how far our faithful witness will reach. Hope in God's promises. Daniel's prophetic visions gave him confidence that history is moving toward God's intended conclusion. The temporary kingdoms of this world will give way to the eternal kingdom of God. This hope sustained Daniel through exile and continues to sustain believers today. The prophet who was torn from his homeland as a teenager and forced into service in a pagan empire left a legacy that has influenced billions of people over thousands of years. His life proves that one person, committed to God regardless of circumstances, can make an eternal difference. Daniel never saw Jerusalem restored. He never returned to his homeland. He died in exile, still serving in a foreign court. Yet his faithfulness produced fruit that far exceeded anything he could have imagined. His prayers helped bring about the return of his people to Jerusalem. His prophecies provided the framework for understanding God's plan for history. His example inspired countless believers facing their own trials. As we close the story of Daniel, we're left with a profound question. Will we, like Daniel, remain faithful to God regardless of the personal cost? Will we maintain our integrity when compromise would be easier? Will we trust God's sovereignty when circumstances seem chaotic? Will we prioritize our relationship with God even when busy with legitimate responsibilities? Daniel's story is not ultimately about him. It's about the God who sustained him, protected him, gave him wisdom, and worked through him to accomplish divine purposes. The same God who was with Daniel in Babylon is with believers today, wherever we find ourselves. The question is not whether God will be faithful. He always is. The question is whether we will be faithful to him. May Daniel's legacy inspire us to lives of unwavering devotion, uncompromising integrity, and unshakable trust in the God who is sovereign over all kingdoms and endures forever. His story reminds us that no matter how dark the night, no matter how fierce the lions, no matter how powerful the empire, God's faithful servants are never truly alone. And in the end, when all earthly kingdoms have crumbled to dust, those who remained faithful will rise to receive their eternal inheritance in the kingdom that will never end. If Daniel's incredible journey has touched your heart and strengthened your faith, we'd love to have you join us for more powerful biblical stories. From the courage of Esther, who risked everything to save her people, to the mighty prophet Elijah, who called down fire from heaven, to the apostle Paul, who transformed from persecutor to preacher, these accounts of faith, miracles, and God's faithfulness continue to inspire millions today. Subscribe to our channel and hit that like button so you won't miss these extraordinary testimonies of God's power working through ordinary people who chose to trust him completely. Share this video with someone who needs encouragement in their own lion's den today. Remember, the same God who shut the mouths of lions for Daniel is the same God who walks with you through your trials right now. He is faithful, he is powerful, and he never abandons those who put their trust in him. Until we meet again in our next biblical journey, may the God of Daniel be your strength, your wisdom, and your shield. Keep the faith, stay strong, and never forget you serve the King of Kings, whose kingdom will have no end. God bless you abundantly, and we'll see you in the next chapter of God's incredible story.